TrippFuller is a theologian, minister, and podcaster. He's the founder and host of Homebrewed Christianity, one of the most downloaded theology programs in podcasting history. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow in theology and science at the University of Edinburgh.
Well, hello, friends. Welcome again to the Courageous Faith Summit. As you have been watching these recordings over the week, I hope that you have enjoyed the content that we've given you. You may have seen that Convergence really smartly partnered for this summit with our friends at Homebrewed Christianity. And it's my honor to interview TrippFuller, who is the founder of Homebrewed Christianity and who has been one of the conversation partners that you have seen and will continue to see this week with voices asking the big question: what is the future of spirituality? And so, Tripp, I know you've been asking these questions a lot, and I now get to ask these questions of you. I'm really thrilled that you're with us. How's it going over in your world?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know what I'm going to feel like when this is being, played as part of the whole summit. But, right now I just finished putting kids to bed and everyone seemed to cooperate. So I'm not anticipating thumping coming over my head and then you going, Tripp, is everything okay? Because my headphones block it all out. So I think that's good. We have one more week of classes, and then it's just a lot of grading. So I'm getting emails from people that haven't read the syllabus.
Right. Wanting to know how they can make up for lost time in a short week. Yeah. Grad school.
Exactly. But you want to know what you and I'm doing during the summit?
What's that?
Ask me where I'll be during the summit.
Where are you going to be during the summit, Tripp?
Paris, France.
Oh, one of my favorite places in the whole world.
Yeah.
That's one of the best things about living where you live right now. You are on a 3-year job at the University of Edinburgh. And so I know the pandemic screwed up a lot of that, but you have had the chance. You're having the chance now to do more like European travel, and it's so easy when you're over there. So I
know this is our first big trip.
I will not
out.
contain my jealousy. It does make me a little envious that you get.
Well, we've got 2.5 years of just being in Scotland.
I know, right?
We're going to Paris for Easter and then over to Brussels for visiting historical battlefields of World War I, which is what our 14-year-old is very into.
I love it. I love it. Well, let's dig in. We want to continue these conversations around what the future of spirituality is. And I think you offer a really interesting perspective, both as someone who is teaching on a graduate level, someone who has authored books and articles around both a very constructed faith and a more spiritual approach to our existence. And so how do you think we are being focused, or faith is being reshaped as we kind of exit these pandemic days? Is spirituality different because of what happened with the pandemic, or do you think that faith and or spirituality has changed?
Yeah, I think I definitely think it's different. And it in some sense, responding to these questions, I'm trying not to steal everyone's best responses that they gave me. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I ran this project with, at that point, one of my colleagues, Sarah Lane Ritchie, who's also going to be sharing later. And we had probably 30 different scholars from different departments and areas, and it was called TheoCon. And we held, they all did like 20-minute keynote lectures and then these big online discussions and things. And it's amazing to me going back and looking at them, what were how the answering this question in that first lockdown. Like, oh, solidarity among the species and the planet. We're going to, all that kind of stuff. And then it's kind of like after about 6 months, everyone's like, yeah, I don't know. And then it got, then the pandemic and everything around it got tribalized, got turned into partisan material. Every community was splintering in different ways. The death toll just keep rising, and we got numb to it. And I think a lot of it really shifted after a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and things, when eventually at some point there was like a white lash and things started shifting. And I don't think that was the break. I think there was the initial response, just like after 9/11, everyone gets back together and they're like, oh, we got to figure this out. And they're like, hey, we should just lie and go to war in a place unrelated and not question whether or not we should still be supplying Saudi Arabia arms, which is where the majority of the hijackers came from, by the way. So I think that we have this tendency occasionally as a species when we feel a collective threat to rally. A lot of the response, right, to the Russian incursion in Ukraine. But then very quickly we accommodate to a new normal and then go back into the system we were before, and the flow we were before. But then we go in after a crisis where there's not a resolution, where we haven't changed in response. So we go back into it more anxious, more fearful. And then what does security look like? A lot of times it's finding the people with the same prejudice or ideas or commitments and then repeating them to each other. I noticed it in my Twitter stream, and I only follow people that I think that like me, anyway.
Right. I mean, we're all tribal in that way, in one way or another, whether we try to be intentional about not being that way or not. It is by nature who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think when we ask the question of it impacting spirituality, that's one part. And that if a global pandemic with millions of people dying doesn't really force us into acting different, then it's made me more depressed about us ever getting together to act about our ecological. Yeah. Maybe a nuke, but I don't want to find out if that worked, Yeah. So that's one part. The other is the ongoing impact of isolation. Mm-hmm. And just having talked to a number of people that run data for different research, research cooperatives, it's really varied at this point. The few things that it seemed to be clear across it are that a lot of people have questioned re-engaging in major institutions. Now, a lot of people hear this like, oh, well, there's, a 30% drop in most congregations in attendance or that. But I mean, the same thing's true about showing up at your office.
Right.
So I'm going to be fascinated to hear. There's a couple big countries in the EU that are having their census take place this year about what kind of responses people get. There's so many little things. I'm interested on people getting taxes in on time. Like one of my friends that works kind of studying the health of institutions across different disciplines. He said he's genuinely worried, and because after the pandemic, there was a level of disengagement, not because people don't want community, but because the institutions were revealed to be futile and actually part of the problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that's going to change spirituality going forward. But I don't know what it's going to look like. But I would just say we need to recognize that a lot of people thought life was better getting a small check from the government and figuring out how to pinch pennies than to go to their crappy job with no future. And a lot of people would rather watch a YouTube video than to go into a congregation.
Yeah.
Like there's so many of these little things, and we don't have to go into just how destructive institutions of democracy are at this point, or anyway. But I think that's a very pressing question in my head.
So to keep going with the kind of institutional and congregational question, but if you don't mind, I want to backtrack really quickly because I'm curious. Do you think that this started way before the pandemic actually hit, and that the pandemic shone a light on and exposed the cracks that in both our beings as humans and what we're really made of, or do you think that the pandemic really was the accelerator? Like, do you have a perspective on whether we didn't see the train until the train had come around the corner, but we should have heard it coming? Like, what are your thoughts there?
So I mean, I definitely think it accelerated certain trends, but the trends I think were already seeable if you wanted to see them, right? Like, one of the reasons it was hard to notice them is because the people that needed to notice them are the ones who actually had places in leadership and institutions, and you kind of become a leader because you love the place. Right. So if you are a leader in a congregation, you likely had a good youth minister, a college ministry experience, went to seminary, enjoyed it, and you like some denomination enough to be affiliated with them. I mean, like, even if you think of your own story, like, you were patient and tried to work with the UMC, right? Like, I think you're like waiting like in the next 12 months to get that apology call. So I think that part of why some people are shocked are because they were in institutions and then trying to run them for the people that kept showing up, who are the ones that were kind of cool with how things are going. But I think it was accelerating trends. And in here, I would put it this way: for most of human history, the distinction that is live today between religion and spirituality was really hard. There is intrinsic and extrinsic religion, right? Like the forms of it, and then when you had the feels or whatnot. But you lived in a culture where you were born somewhere and died somewhere, and anyone you talked to, where you learned language and how you had big movements in your life and rituals and transitions, all of it was embedded in like some mythopoetic structure of your religion. The framing narrative of everyone was tied up in it. This was actually not a bad thing. It was how Homo sapiens won as a species over the others, that we developed mythopoetic symbolic structures that intensified our ability to cooperate past blood, genes, connections. And we're kind of running an experiment now on the globe of what do you do when you need even more cooperation because of the problems we face, climate change, impending nuclear problems. We're starting to mess technologically with the biome, our genetics. Anyway, there's tons of, we could come up with a list of them and go, you know what we need to do this? If we want this to go well, we need giant cooperation. And at the same time, the big stories that used to hold us there, where we had told our own story and made sense of where we came from, where we're going, and why what we're doing matters, no longer are those stories that we share in common. One, where if you're in the West, there's one good God who desires us to be faithful, whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, right? Now, there's a pluralist cornucopia of sorts, and one of the effects of it is that we want to honor the neighbor, right? So we're going to be on our best days, like, recognize difference is a good thing. But then all of a sudden, those questions of where we came from, where we're going, what does meaning, purpose, goodness look like, and all those things become private. It's not something the culture has within it. And they have that question at the large. It's all of a sudden becomes something you have to bear on your own. And that's a huge burden. And if we asked ourselves, is there a narrative that we all share? I feel like there's been a migration from a shared religious narrative. If you think of after World War II, really from the Enlightenment up to World War II, was the dominant narrative was the nation state and the birth of democracies and all this kind of things. And then after World War II, for a lot of reasons that we don't have to go into right now, but it migrates to the market.
Right.
And what tells us what good is, what success is, and all these kinds of things? The market. And that's the story we all share. Mm-hmm. That is, I think, the spiritual crisis of our time. Mm-hmm. What that looks like for each of us is be more efficient. Mm-hmm. Get ahead. Think of what it means if you're a parent. I was a youth minister at a very large UCC church in Los Angeles. It meant youth group was great if it went on your college application to get into the Ivy League schools and such. Not good if it meant almost anything else. And we get why, right? Because you realize there's a dwindling number of rings on the ladder of sustainability, and more and more people know that the next generation is going to get screwed in ways that their generation didn't. And you don't want your kid to be one of the ones that are left behind and go down in class and status and all that kind of stuff. So you have to train them up right. And then at some point they'll retire and get to the good life. It'll be great, right? That, I think, is where we have a spiritual crisis in the present. And that was already alive before lockdown. It's just in lockdown, a lot of people that experienced burnout found out they would rather be at home in a pandemic, homeschooling, than go back to a career that's sucking their life out of it. Mm-hmm. Then there were others who found out that their essential worker status meant the market is going to keep killing you and not recognize you. Like, if you think of all the worst things, it seemed like you either realized you were stuck in a system and want to opt out, or it got worse. And the number of people that accelerated and go, I don't like the bargain I was told,
right,
is high. And if we continue as religious groups to think we succeed by making people good cogs in a system that is death dealing, we suck. So I think as individuals, we have this predicament, but as leaders in faith communities, then we have a real challenge.
Yeah.
But if we have a challenge, we can do something, as opposed to pretending we just need to get more people, have better programs, that kind of stuff. And, move on the line. It'll be great. It's just like having a best friend at a coffee house.
Right. It's interesting. I have been thinking a lot about space, the spaces that we occupy, and recognized that for many, many, many years, I had 3 spaces in my life. I had home, I had work, and I had church. Those were the 3 spaces that I occupied. And most people have those first 2, a home space or a place where they lay their head, a workspace, a place where they and that could be in their home, but it's still a space. And then that 3rd space is different, I think, for many of us. But for a lot of Westerners, that 3rd space was church. And so if we're thinking about church as a space where community is offered, where spirituality is grown, where faith is nurtured, where we are intellectually and emotionally stimulated by both the humans that we encounter and the God that we are in the midst of, then what does that mean for faith communities in these times? I mean, do we think that faith communities even have the possibility of rekindling that 3rd space narrative? And if they do, how are they going to pull it off? What's required of them? What kind of courage is it going to take? And if they can't, then what's the alternative?
Yeah, I guess one, I would just say, I think answering that question's above my pay grade, in some sense, right?
Same.
So I don't want my answer to like exude a kind of confidence that I don't have.
Hang on, I'm going to just take notes real quick so that I can make sure I don't miss anything.
But there are two things that come to mind. One is that congregations it have assumed they are every member's third space, and that you're the chosen preferential option, like for what you do after you've earned your money and fed your kids, right? Like, and the church was the third space built around a nuclear family in the West, which is a artificial construction in and of itself. And so I think that like in some sense there is like a list of changes you could make where there are more humans where church could become a third space, right? Like if how many people that you wish were at your church work when all the times it meets? Like there are plenty. So, I mean, there's some basic things that you could do, but apart from that, like, what does it mean when everyone has 5 or 6 other spaces where they have feeding into it? And I don't know if this was, I can't even remember who told me this. It may be in something everyone on here is going to already hear. But like if you have experienced trauma and hurt from a religious congregation, you are not likely, even if you find another one you love, going to put all your third space energy, in scare quotes, into one community because you know what it can do. I mean, I've heard the same from people that are deeply invested in activism and then are hurt by, like, you know, at least on my side, like there's nothing quite like getting 4 Marxists together. There are like 9 interpretations of Marx, and they're all more hardcore than the others, and then they're mean. It's like getting 5 Baptists together, and you know, like the same kind of thing happens in any group. So I think that one of the changes in our context is that people do not trust any institution to be their other thing. Being a part of local politics in Los Angeles, that was true. The old timers are like, no, I've been a part of the LA County Democratic Party forever, blah, 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 blah. And then there are all these people just want to come in because they really care about this one issue or whatnot. And I'm like, yeah, like, I mean, I was an outsider. I was just like, look, y'all are Democrats. You've been in charge of a very liberal state for a long time. Everyone that's a Democrat has ran on universal health care for the last 5 or 6 years. Y'all been done it. Like, why does anyone, you know, I was a cynical, whiny young person, but all that to say, like, why are we trusting any of these institutions? So you gotta leverage that third space. You gotta cut it up like one of those old Trivial Pursuit things where you got different colors. So you're like, well, I have my faith congregation, but I might go to a different one on high holy days because it got a better choir and an old Gothic cathedral. But for my small group, and by that I mean my yoga class, that's what I do there. And you have like this little pie. And I don't know if in this moment we're going to fix that. I think the sociological trends in the West are towards greater and greater individualization. And Max Weber, kind of the sociologist who talked about cycles in cultures, that it moves to extremes of poles until it collapses back. And I think the isolation of lockdown led to us intensifying the individualization, not snapping back. I'd hope for the snap back, but I'm a communitarian.
Me too.
And I think that like I think it was you that said this, or maybe it was Cameron when we talked before this. One of you made the point that I think we're in for a long haul, and I was just like, oh, this is depressing. But ever since then, I've been thinking that, yeah, I think we haven't made a transition. And so outside of that, then ask yourself, if you're a steward of a religious tradition, a wisdom tradition, what wisdom do we bring for the spiritual crises of our moment? What calls of living do we offer facing the challenges of our age? And then what affirmations and blessings can we give people in our current predicament? And I think that a kind of reframing the human predicament is an important move for wisdom traditions becoming blessings in the current time. How many, if you just think of Protestants in America, think the primary predicament is helping make sure everyone doesn't experience eternal conscious torment? Now, that is a sub-Christian possibility. And I say this as a professional Christian theologian, who's notorious for having a high Christology. So there's that. But
I thought you were going to finish that sentence with all concerned that everyone has like a meal each day.
Well,
eternal torment. Like, oh yeah, there's a vast difference between care of creation and humanity and care of souls for eternity.
Post-mortem soul care.
Right.
And okay, now you and I probably not anxious that the God revealed in Jesus is down to torment people made in God's own image for eternity. But even if you were, like, let's just assume you were, the most effective way of communicating the goodness of the news we carry is not to spend a long time convincing people they have a problem they don't think they have. Right. So I don't think they have it. But if you did, it requires you to give humans a predicament that you now think you have the right solution for. I actually think that Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhs, all the different wisdom traditions actually have such a wealth, a multiplicity, a deep resource of wisdom that they have the ability to respond to the actual predicaments humans experience now. And it's not a foreign concept. Oddly enough, if you read scripture, like, prophets did not address 3 generations earlier's cultural anxieties. Like you don't go into it to talk to Israel when they're in exile and be like, look, you shouldn't be selling arms to the Assyrians. And they're like, whoa, we don't even own property. Yeah, but officially, I just want you to know, as a prophet of the Lord, don't do it. They're like, yeah, but we already did that. That's how we got here. Right. Like, and you don't go to the king and going, look, whenever you get back into power. And so I say all that and go, part of our challenge is to look at today and go, if you think of the giant storehouse of wisdom that the Christian tradition brings as a minister, then I go, what do we bring out to bless the actual lives and the predicaments people are in? And that helps me think about what I do as a theologian, but also as a minister, and with my children, right? Like, I don't have the same anxieties they had. I don't have the same struggles, and we're not that far apart. But I grew up in rural North Carolina around a whole, like, religious diversity was the kind of Baptist you were. And they've grown up in Los Angeles and Edinburgh.
Right.
And, so, like, they don't feel edgy because they think that you could just be Jewish and not become a quote completed Jew, which is what Baptists in rural area used to say. Like, there was one Jewish person in our class. Well, you got to get them to be a Messianic Jew, a completed Jew. Like, and I was like, nah. I was like, have you not read Romans? Paul actually says to the Gentiles, like, God couldn't break that covenant, or else God could break the one with you. Do you think God's breaking the one with you and Jesus? Anyway, so like I say that just to go, the church has had its cheerleaders in charge for so long. Those people think a message that resonates with them should resonate with everyone else. What if we have wisdom that resonates, but the predicament in our situation is really different? That's something to lose sleep on, better than, figuring out how to convince someone they're a filthy sinner and all that kind of stuff to get around to.
So I'd love to continue this thread about your kids, or just kind of younger generations in general. If we take the analogy of kind of Trivial Pursuit pie pieces, and I would venture to say that we would be hard pressed to find half of the younger generation that would say that 1/6 of their Trivial Pursuit disc was made up of a faith and or spirituality pie piece. I think that many of them would say, well, like if you give me like 16 pie pieces, I might put one in there. But I mean, we have been watching a shift in faith, spirituality versus faith, as generations have continued to be born. What does spirituality look like for your kids and for kids like them? I mean, not just in Edinburgh, Scotland, but what do we believe this future of spirituality might, or I think might is probably the operable word, because we just don't know, might look like for the types of generations that you're raising right now in that household of yours?
Yeah. So a couple of things come to mind. One is just thinking about teaching philosophy of religion at a university where, 4/5 of the class aren't Christian. Mm-hmm. And they're learning it in a UK university where the shape of the philosophy of religion class here, until I redid about a third of it, was still built like it was natural theology for, Anglo-Catholics. Like there was no, I had weeks on like ecofeminism and post-theist philosophy of religion and anything touching an Eastern religious, feminist philosophy of religion. Anyway, and I say that because even the atheists are comfortable arguing around those normal terms, and in shifting the philosophy of religion class towards a much more where you don't treat kind of 19th century Anglicanism in this context as crescendo Christianity that you're then yay or naying. If you have the kind of investment that happens in a graduate school class with people from multiple different departments, and you have an expansive account of religion, people then end up having beautiful conversations about meaning, purpose, value, justice, hope, wisdom, pain, joy, all that kind of stuff. But what's amazing is how many of them go, I've had almost no class that raised these kind of questions. So underneath that, I think one of the major institutions that are failing us are universities. Not only are they, obsessed with STEM, giving you jobs and all that kind of thing, but humanities departments have been like the money's gone out of it significantly. It's all the investment per person towards research, getting grants, all these kind of things, rather than like, what do I do with these 30 people in a class and help them take existence seriously? So I do philosophy of religion at say, like, look, campfires forever, human beings, when they stare at them, we start asking questions. We ask some really big ones, and they've been asked in almost every culture. Right. So what would it mean for us in a, enlightened secular Western context to think those questions again? And by the end of the semester, I would say the overwhelming majority are asking questions and having conversations that you wouldn't have unless you were brought into it. So the other side of that observation is, I believe our culture, and especially those geared towards success, it shapes us away from having the kind of investment in spaces, places, relationships that generate the pathos of campfire conversations. And it's not weird that it's happening. An essential part of us being okay, saying yes to the demands that are put on us in our kind of economic system, are ones where if you keep asking those questions, you get yourself in trouble. They don't fit. And I would say I had similar experiences in Los Angeles doing retreats with adults that are on confirmation and are new religious people. They weren't religious before. Even some of the like longtime church members, kids that, they're 16 and now doing confirmation. when you create the context for asking those questions and doing it, there's a thirst for it. And I say that because the response, the last few weeks I've done a couple conferences, online conferences with clergy, and the responses to sharing a bunch of stuff has often been, yeah, well, I think the next generation is not that religious or not that spiritual, blah 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 blah. And when asked for tell me about the person, you don't get enough details to think that they put any effort in getting to know the person's life. And guess what? If you aren't getting to know a person's life, or a community knows you care for them, then you get experience like someone marketing. And we get that done to us all the time.
Yeah.
And so part of our predicament is we live in an age where people want authenticity, and that's also the best way to sell something. Right? And it gets eye rolls when you say it, unless you really mean it. Yeah. And then you're like, I'm being authentic about authenticity this time. And it's so religious communities have this situation where for the majority of their own existence, they told a story to people that already knew it was true, but didn't know what it meant. Now, the story that you kind of have to understand to get the power, it's not known. And so you have to be inviting people. Yeah. Or is it trusted?
It's not known. And if it is known, it's not trusted.
Yeah. That's so, yes, exactly. And that's why I think there's a failure to recognize the task that we have if you're a leader of a religious community, or you deeply belong to one. So as a parent, in lockdown, I've had all the anxieties of, especially here, like it depends on how big your church is to whether you can get in and stuff for another 2 or 3 weeks. But the inertia that being ministers, my wife and I are both ordained. One of us has always been working in a church, basically. So that they had, all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, that's not happening. YouTube church, not for an 8-year-old. You're going to watch this YouTube stream with me? So you rediscover that you have to cultivate rhythms and rituals and habits within the home. And you want to know who I asked? My best friends from high school that were Jewish. Why? Very successful at being a cultural minority with a deep, rich religious and spiritual heritage that gets passed on to everyone in the family, even the ones that aren't sure. If they say God, they cross their fingers. Right. Have the opportunity to embrace and head it. And why is it? Because it's built, the responsibility is primarily within the home. And so many of the festivals and rituals can take place within the home. Everyone can learn to read and engage and converse around Torah. Like it's like the post-temple expressions of Judaism recognized you could not have a cultic home of privilege like the temple. Christendom spread because it befriended under the permission and then the privilege of an empire. And so I think as a parent, I think, what could we learn now for how we practice the faith at home and pass it on, such that we don't assume they're going to pick it up by osmosis and, Bible Belt excitement, or because we just go to church every week or whatever. And mainline Protestantism, that's when it won, right? Like mainline Protestantism was the dominant religious expression, right, when you knew that families brought their kids to church. Right. And they're actually really good at that. They still are. if you go to a mainline Protestant church and your family goes to church every week and your kids participate in everything, like they will think that this is really important. It's just soccer and whatever else.
Right. Anything else that's interfering. Right.
Yeah. And I didn't even know that there were humans that were allowed to do anything else on Sunday.
Same.
Yeah.
I was the same way. I mean, when I started to recognize that I had friends that didn't go to church on Sunday, and started to question why, the only answer was like, my parents don't make me, or my parents don't want to. Never because, we had a soccer game, or my, study group was meeting at that time, or my mom's quilt group meets on Sunday mornings, and so she can't take me. Yeah, there was nothing ever going on. It was just, we don't. So
yeah, it's so true.
So to kind of button this up, what do you think it looks like for people to be courageous in spirituality? What does it look like for us to take a look at the future, for us to gaze into what's possible and be courageous in that work, both for how we are in the world and how we are encouraging others to be in the world? What does that look like to you?
Well, I think a courageous faith, especially around the question of spirituality, is going to resist the legacy of dualism. Like, for so much of Western history, dualism framed our religious and spiritual conversation. So there's like material things, everything in the world, and they run very machine-like. And then humans are the exception because there's a spirit in our machine. Thank you, Rene Descartes and company. And it has a legacy that's pretty ugly. If you think of, he responded to someone talking about the study of rabbits in the laboratory, and they make noises like they're having pain. He says, no, they're just material. It just sounds like that. And underneath a dualism that humans are spiritual by exception from the rest of nature, that bifurcation of nature has a legacy. Then over time, science started to explain so much stuff that then you have the emergence of people that are like, well, there is no such thing as like some supernatural spirit thing. We're just matter in mechanical motion. At that moment, and this is, depending on where you are in the world, but sometime in the 18th, 19th century, that view became so dominant that the proper spiritual response was to defend supernaturalism, because everyone agrees in some sense that about the material order, and it's shaped by scientific investigation. And now we're going to defend it. And so think of like the crappiest apologists that everyone's forced to engage. So it's like a string of Hebrew Bible verses. And you're like, this evidence demands a verdict. You're like, what verdict does that demand? Obviously, the Trinitarian affirmation. And you're like, all right. Or like you go to like answers in Genesis.
Yeah.
Have you seen the Cambrian explosion? How can you explain that, Mr. Darwin? And like, so all this kind of stuff, you have this whole battle. And underneath it, you have the theists arguing over here and the atheists over there, and they're screaming at each other, trying to be like, oh, here's my proof, here's my reason, and all that kind of stuff. But underneath it was an assumption of whether or not we are like material monists, like it's just matter and motion and stuff, or we're supernatural dualists. And I think that sucks. It's just not good. It's not right scientifically and philosophically. Like, that's what my professional job is in religion science faculty. Right. But here's why I think it's so important for the future of spirituality and what a courageous faith would look like. If we aren't spiritual because we're the exception to nature, but what if spirituality is something that's inherent within it? What if all things have a kind of dignity before the one that made them, knows them, and loves them completely? And there's a dignity built for each creature. There's I don't have to, it's too long to go into an excursus of all the things this entails. But part of what it means then is it's not foreign to have an ongoing relationship with the divine. And I think that when you realize that that's not an odd idea, it has explanatory power in lots of other ways, then what does courageousness look like? You don't then have to defend the intervention, the eruption, the justification for your whatever your tribal religious, thing is. If, I don't know, like Paul says, God is where we live, move, and have our being. Right. If the world exists in God and God participates in the world, then each moment of existence is a moment of God and the world entangled. And in that case, the courageous thing for me and how I think about my own responsibility is moment to moment and decision to decision to say, like, what does a courageous faith look like now? What does it mean to say yes to the possibilities that are before me in this moment so that I join God in working for beauty, goodness, justice, love, or just like not being horrible, because that's sometimes all I can manage. And I think that oftentimes the religious inertia from Christendom, the religious inertia for having to have a whole complete system where all the answers are, is that then we get anxious the moment we don't have every answer. Because what do we feel like we're responsible for? Everything. And then we're like, and then you have all this stuff to explain. There's all sorts of things we have knowledge of we aren't responsible for, but we're responsible to all sorts of things. But in all those places that we have responsibility, we have our own agency. So what do we want the courage to do? To take responsibility for where we actually can say and do and care and love and show up. Yeah. And when we do that, we actually can join God in that moment, because God and the world meet with each moment of becoming. In what ways can we increase the responsiveness of the world to God? Only through us. We can't make our kids do it, or the people at our church do it, or the other people that are next to us, or people watching this. The only person you actually have control over is you. But when you join God in each moment, it sets up for the next moment what are the possibilities that are being inherited? It's where our contribution, our materializing the divine invitation, is now inherited in the next moment and can open up new possibilities. Courage, I think, is the courage to trust that God is always present and inviting every creature in every moment in every space. In fact, you could say, like, you could even go down to Sheol and you couldn't escape the love of God. But what if we have courage, then we can let God be God and say yes to God where we can. And what the big picture and all that kind of stuff works out, all the explanations for everything. I mean, I professionally like to think about them, but they're like above our pay grade. Right. But we do get to decide what we sow. Yeah. And I think that is a kind of courageous spirituality that means we can even look back at ourselves when we were saying yes to God in places we find gross now. And go, I was responding and it helped bring me to this point. And we can see times we even had really good ideas in our head and we're assholes. And can go, I was saying no, even though I thought beautiful things. Yeah. And that reframes thinking about what it is we're doing in the moment. What are we being invited into? And do I have the courage and faith to say yes? And I know that part of my spirituality is saying yes. And that opens up greater depths in the next moment. Just like any habit of responsiveness.
I love it. I love it. I feel like you just gave us the sermon and the benediction. And we didn't even have to have a hymn in between to, call people to the altar. Oh, Tripp, this has been a great conversation. I'm so glad that you partnered with us on this journey. I'm so glad that the Homebrewed Christianity folks are along for this ride, and Convergence and me are grateful for that. I could talk to you all day. Some days we do talk all day, but today we'll say goodbye for now. And I'm really grateful that you were a part of this with us.
Awesome. I've enjoyed it, and all of you that have been listening and stuff, make sure you connect on internet spaces, because
Yes.
I'm excited to hear what goes through people's minds when they hear all these different voices in a few days.
Right.
Like, I want to know the takeaways. So you
Yeah.
should tag Anna and I.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah.
We'll share our socials in the notes.
All right.
All right. Thanks, friends. Hope you're having a good, courageous faith journey. If you have any questions, reach out to Convergence or to Homebrew Christianity. And we hope that you are enjoying these conversations as much as we are. We'll see you soon.